Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Douglas Brunt, the author of The Mysterious Case of Rudolf Diesel, Genius, Power, and Deception on the Eve of World War I. This is his third book. He's also a host on Sirius XM and was the CEO of an internet security firm. Douglas, Mr. Brunt, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Evan.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. You know the feeling when you're stuck in traffic or you're walking down the street and the engine of a giant truck is roaring and rattling next to you and you kind of start running to get away from it, right? It's a little unsettling, even though you know that as long as you don't breathe in too hard at that moment, you're going to be safe. Those engines that are so uncomfortable to be around actually power much of our economy, even to this day. Invented in the 1890s, it powers virtually every truck, cargo ship, and piece of heavy equipment. So, Douglas, how come no one, including me, and apparently including you, has had any idea that diesel is the name of a person and not just another word for gasoline?
That is a big part of the mystery. The history of the man behind the engine has been completely paved over these last 100 years. And, so I came into the story because, as you know, I bought an old boat as one of the things you mentioned. Diesel powers just about everything today. And I bought an old boat and I was in the boatyard and I was saying, what should I do to fix up this boat? And the guy on the boatyard said, well, you should repower it from these gasoline engines to diesel. And I said, why? It's a better engine. 100% of boat fires come from gasoline engines. 0 come from diesel. The fuel's not flammable. It doesn't have fumes. And it only explodes inside the engine at great pressure. There's no spark to ignite the fuel of a diesel engine. You can take a lit match and drop it into a barrel of diesel fuel and it won't ignite. And the efficiency is 3 to 4x the range. So on my 200-gallon tank, I could go 4 times as far on diesel. So we had all these reasons. So I repowered to diesel. And then a few years later, in my prior books are all novels. I'd been writing fiction and I was searching around for ideas to write the next novel. And I was Googling around on funny lists of things that might inspire something cool. And I came across this list of mysterious disappearances at sea. And on the list was Rudolf Diesel. And I thought, my gosh, diesel, I wonder if that has anything to do with my engines. And of course, then discovered that many people around the world are misspelling diesel with a lowercase d all these years. There actually is a man. So unlike Ford, Chrysler, Benz, that all get their capital letter because we all know there was Henry Ford and Carl Benz, there is Rudolf Diesel, who at the time of his disappearance in 1913 was like an Elon Musk of the age. He was a famous person. When he disappeared, it was front page headlines everywhere.
So who was he before the invention? Where was he born? How did he grow up? What other things did he tinker around with before he worked on engines and gasoline, although not gasoline, but his own formula?
Not a rich guy, and his parents had emigrated from Germany, from Augsburg, Germany, to Paris in 1850, and he was born in 1858 in Paris. So they were really a Germanic family. Germany, as the state that we have come to know it in the 20th and 21st century, did not exist then. Germany as a state only came to being in 1871 at the end of the Franco-Prussian War. So Prussia and 39 other Germanic states, fought these wars. Then Bismarck created Germany, but they were considered Germanic peoples. He was from Bavaria. And so when the Franco-Prussian War broke out in 1870, anyone of Germanic origin was expelled from France. So he and his family, who were already not rich, his dad was a leather worker and had a sort of a trade shop in Paris, and he would make leather goods and bind books and things like that. They had to leave penniless. They had to abandon their home because, there was rioting and looting and, anyone German had to get out of there. So they get on this ferry from France to London, where they live. And they're they're nomadic at this point. They have no money. They're living in tenement housing and barely scraping by. And he has a distant relation back in Germany who sends a letter, and they know he's a pretty bright kid, and his sister is actually a very gifted piano player. And he gets a letter inviting him to go back to Augsburg to, at least get his sort of rudimentary elementary education. And from there, he sees that opportunity, and within 10 years was inhabiting the elite engineering circles of Germany.
What kinds of things were they tinkering around with, and how did things sort of funnel towards this major invention?
When he eventually moved from Augsburg to study at the university level in Munich, and one of his teachers was Carl von Linde, who was a pioneer of refrigeration. And so they were studying, heat engines. And they were, Nicholas Cugnot and Sadi Carnot. And one of the things they looked at was the first steam car, which looked like this giant 2-ton teapot on 3 wheels. And it was basically a steam engine that could move this thing about 2 miles an hour, but it was powerful. It was steam technology, very early forms of steam technology that could, haul cannon or haul heavy loads and things like that. But he was perplexed at how inefficient these engines were. You'd boil all this, you'd shovel in coal to a furnace, it would get hot, it would boil water, the water would generate steam, the steam would move the engine. So you had the intermediary substance of water, and he was very focused on efficiency. From university, he actually worked a little bit for Carl von Linde in refrigeration, but his passion all through this time was finding a way to develop an energy source that would be far more efficient than the external combustion of steam technology.
As he stumbles on this invention, did he know that it was major at the time? In other words, would he be able to imagine the unbelievably widespread use that it has today, 120 years later?
He thought he was onto something big. And in fact, he would write letters to different people, and they're like, you're a little better than steam, but, I don't know if you got it exactly. But he really believed that he could. And he did develop something that, in theory was super efficient. And then, how much of that in theory can you achieve? And he achieved an enormous amount of it. But he was very excited about the efficiency that he achieved it. But in his mind, it was always going to be this power source that was compact. He didn't need, with a steam engine, the image I like to paint is in this famous scene of the movie Titanic with Leonardo DiCaprio. They go down into the belly of the ship, and you see dozens and dozens of men with their shirts off, sweating, shoveling tons of coal into these orange, fiery furnaces.
Yeah, I remember that scene. Yeah, it imprints on you. Yeah.
Massive. And then has a whole chimney apparatus. He wanted a little compact engine that didn't have any of that. It would just draw fuel automatically down from a tank. There was no fire. There was no giant vat of water to boil like a pot on a stove in a giant thing. It was just a small engine that could power rural businesses like that of his father. And that never came to be. That was more like the Tesla electric motor. His engine served purposes that he did not intend, which was big business and war.
Yeah, and I before we get to some of that, I realize you're not necessarily a scientist, but I assume you've done it. I mean, obviously you've done a ton of research. What made diesel better for a truck or heavy machinery as opposed to my Toyota Camry sitting in the garage?
One of the things that made it better was what made it so hard to build is it used the best metallurgy of the time, heavier cast iron parts that fit together neatly. But so it's more complex to build. The engine is actually much heavier. So in the beginning, it wouldn't work for these, like the Benz first motor car was like a 0.5 horsepower thing that looked like a large bicycle, and these smaller gasoline engines with lightweight parts. The early steam engines didn't have the metallurgy technology to maintain a tight seal. They would bind their seals with rope and leather and things. So of course, enormous amounts of pressure and power were being lost to inefficient metallurgy. So he used very sophisticated metallurgy, very expensive, crafted parts.
You alluded to some of this, but what were the 1890s like in terms of science, technology, and society? What made it feel like as though they were on the dawn of something huge, both in the United States and in Europe?
It's one of the things I love about this book is that age. It's sort of in America we called it the Gilded Age, but it was a booming time of innovation and industry. I call it sort of like Downton Abbey, the early years. It was before that hinge in history of World War I came, where all of these empires collapsed, the way people lived changed. And the Industrial Revolution, of course, was driving some of that urbanization and centralization. But it was a time when there were royal courts all around Europe. And think about how many empires collapsed after World War I. The Russian Empire, the German Empire, the Austrian Empire, the Ottoman Empire. It all became much more of like a Western democratic-looking government around Europe. And the cast of characters is amazing. So his contemporaries are Edison, Marconi, Tesla, Bell, and one of the cast of characters in this book who plays a major role is Adolphus Busch, who's a pioneer of the brewing industry and co-founder of Anheuser-Busch and Budweiser, who was a real technical pioneer and a pioneer of diesel technology in America. He had the exclusive rights to diesel in North America, which he used initially to pump water in his breweries and to power refrigeration, but also he had a separate business that was building diesel engines for the U.S. Navy and submarines.
You say at the beginning of the book that you were magnetically drawn to the story of Rudolf Diesel, and you described the phenomenon of putting this boat together and someone suggesting diesel, and that's how this all got started. But you also say you were drawn to the events of September 29th, 1913. So before you started your research and you began exploring this and unraveling this, what was the common belief about what happened to Rudolf Diesel that night?
This is a great way to get into it because it's how I got into it when I read that list of mysterious disappearances at sea. September 29, 1913, Rudolf Diesel is traveling from Belgium to Great Britain on an overnight passenger ferry. And in the middle of the night, he disappears. He's traveling with two companions, and they have dinner on the ship as they're traveling across the North Sea, and they agree to meet in the morning at 6 o'clock. And the morning comes around, they look for Rudolph, and he's not there. They check his stateroom, he's not there. They hold the ship at sea. They search it, can't find anything except his folded coat and a hat at the stern of the ship by the rail, seeming to mark the place where he'd gone overboard. So the prevailing theory was suicide, and also two theories of murder also emerged and made headlines in newspapers around the world. One was that Kaiser Wilhelm, the Emperor of Germany, had dispatched agents to kill him. And the reason for that was by 1913, every navy of the major powers was scrambling for diesel power because diesel had emerged as the only viable option to power submarines and U-boats. And we were in the middle of a massive military arms race, particularly a naval arms race between Germany and Great Britain. And both navies were scrambling for diesel power to build their submarine fleets, particularly the Germans. And Rudolf was traveling across the North Sea to Great Britain because he was co-founder and board director of a new diesel engine manufacturing company founded in Great Britain, the mandate of which was to provide diesel engines for the Royal Navy's submarine program. The other theory of murder was Rockefeller, John Rockefeller, the richest man in the world.
I couldn't believe the names in the book and in the press kit for this book. I was like, John Rockefeller, really? Like a suspect?
Yeah. And, the crazy thing about it is by 1913, it still wasn't settled what the prevailing fuel to power the world was going to be. It wasn't really settled that it would be petroleum and gasoline. We didn't start selling more gasoline than kerosene until 1916. Rockefeller is the richest man in the world because he was in the illumination business. They would drill for petroleum and distill it down to kerosene, and they would throw away the gasoline until, in the early years, gasoline was a nuisance waste product. They would sell kerosene for illumination. And they were then threatened by Edison and others who were developing the light bulb and the electricity, which was threatening to do to kerosene and Rockefeller what he had done to the whaling business and, whale blubber for illumination. So he was very much on the ropes. And another interesting thing that's in the book, which I'm sure you read, which is in 1905, the New York City taxi fleet was comprised of hundreds of electric cars. And it's funny that we think now, oh, here's Elon Musk and these newfangled electric car things.
Not new at all.
There was a charging station for electric cars on Broadway in Times Square, 1905. And that was a threat to Rockefeller and his future business as well. So illumination's wiped out for him. Kerosene, he knows, is going away. And he needs the internal combustion engine, and he needs it running on gasoline. But Rudolf didn't need that. Not only did he not need it, but he advocated against it. He was saying, all these countries have farmers. We can grow our own fuel. His engine ran on vegetable oil, And he won the 1900 Paris World's Fair with a diesel engine running on nut oil, peanut oil. So he was out there quoted in newspapers saying, I can break the American fuel monopoly, and I don't need some law to do it. I don't need the Sherman antitrust. I can do it with my technology.
Can we maybe bring him back for just like 5 minutes maybe and try this all over again? I want to ask about the suicide theory. What did you before you get into what all the findings were, and I have some questions also about how you put this book together, but what credible, if any, theory is there for this man just got sick of his life and jumped off and over the side of the ship?
Not much. That's what drew me to the story in the beginning. It was the prevailing theory of suicide, which did not make sense with the character of the man in the years prior, or in any years prior.
It doesn't. Yeah.
Immediately prior. Letters to his wife just before. So without giving away
I don't want to.
Book, I didn't believe suicide. And the other theories of murder, I wanted to explore further too. And again, I hesitate to, sort of unveil too much, but it just seemed like there were a lot of holes in just about everything. And so, funnily enough, I was initially thinking, well, maybe I'll write this book as historical fiction because there's so little written about Rudolf Diesel. I'm like, well, but I have the scaffolding of the story and I can fill it in with some dialogue and I'll kind of make it up and I'll stay true to the thrust of it. And then as I got into it, I found more research and I was developing a theory of the case of my own. And I thought, I've got to write it as nonfiction. It's all there. I just need to dig deeper. And I actually think it's becoming an investigation where I can crack it.
Yeah, I think you made the right choice there. Yeah.
And the more I found, the more it was clear what happened.
Yeah. All right. So just process wise here, I love asking this question. What were your sources for the book? And what makes it interesting in particular for you is that a lot of this, and I don't know what your foreign language abilities are. Mine are zero. A lot of what you had to do here was uncover foreign languages and foreign newspapers. How did you piece this together? I mean, did you have Google Translate, on lockdown here?
Well, no, a lot of it was old American newspapers and British newspaper archives. There's a lot on the Adolphus Bush side here in the U.S., a fair amount in the U.K., but as you suggest, the bulk of it was in German language, which I do not speak. And so I contacted a buddy of mine who's back at my high school who runs the English department. He put me in contact with the German professor at the school. And this guy just did a wonderful job. He is German. German's his first language, English his second. And so he went through reams of things like Diesel's diaries. He made 2 big trips to America, one in 1904, one in 1912, tons of letters, business documents, and other things out of archives. There's some terrific material in archives in Germany, one at MAN, M-A-N, Maschinenfabrik, Augsburg, Nuremberg, also the Deutsches Museum. And then the more I got into it, I actually got in touch with a couple of distant relations of Rudolf Diesel living still, one who had tried to do a bit of sleuthing himself, and he put me in touch with an archive, a naval archive, one in Belgium, one in Denmark. They had some interesting old material as well. But, a lot of this was also done during COVID, which was really challenging. And so some of these archives I couldn't get into, but I was able to make some great, I guess, sort of digital remote friendships with people who would scan things and send them to me. And then if I needed to translate them, I would.
To a fault, I am way too interested in American history and not enough in the history of the other 99.99% of countries. And even when it comes to those other countries, I often study the impact that America has had on those countries. How difficult was it for you to, and I don't know, what types of history you're interested in, but how difficult was it for you to sort of take your America hat off a little bit and get into the mindset of people living in another country 125 years ago?
Baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware. And there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
No. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
It's not too different than trying to imagine America 125 years ago. You're still going to somewhere else. I am fascinated with World War I. I would say 25 years ago, I was more interested in World War II, and I did everything on World War II, read everything, looked at every documentary and things like that. But I've since found World War I to be even more interesting, because World War II is this fascinating, good versus evil. It's the Star Wars, Empire Strikes Back kind of story. World War I is more nuanced in a way. The kings, the monarchs of these countries were all related. Kaiser Wilhelm II was cousins with King George V and with Tsar Nicholas II, who ultimately they go to war. The Germans and the British were much more likely to be allies than enemies. They were related. The whole British throne, as we know to this day, has Germanic origin. And in the end, it was almost like musical chairs. And then when the music stopped, it's like, who was sitting there? It's like, all right, well, that's how we're going to do the war, because we're going to have it in 1913 now. This is how everybody's getting along. So that's the war. If you went 10 years earlier, it could easily, or even 3 years earlier, it could have been Germany and England fighting together. It was never kind of a foregone thing. And then they fight this huge war. And then when it's over, it's like, my God, why did we even do that? Like the whole diplomacy of that era, I just find fascinating. I mean, it's a horrible tragedy, so it's careful using the word like fascinating and interesting, but it's just an incredible thing to study. So I've been fascinated with that, and I've read tons of it, and I just find it to be a very interesting period, and so I've been so immersed in it that it was easy to write it, I guess.
How important, it was cool to look at your website. How important was it for you to visit some of the locations that shaped Diesel's life, like his boyhood home? Does that impact a writer's mind?
It did. I was pretty far along in the structure and the book. I had a lot of writing still to go and polishing to go, and I think it did help me. And I felt emotional seeing his childhood home. And one of the things that got me, and if you've been to my site, you saw it, that plaque marking his childhood home in Paris. It is so cast aside. It's just this plaque. There's a bunch of graffiti on it and stickers on the wall, and the deficit of appreciation for Rudolf Diesel is enormous. And as I said earlier, spelled with a lowercase d, and yet consider a piece of like a pineapple grown in a tropical region today. All the heavy farm equipment used to grow that pineapple, diesel powered, gets loaded onto a truck, diesel powered, taken down to a crane, which is diesel powered, which loads it onto a cargo ship. 100% of cargo ships in the world to this day, 120 years later, all diesel. Goes across the ocean, unloaded onto a truck, onto a train. All trains are diesel. Goes to a grocery store, the power plant nearby, likely diesel. It's just still completely enables our global economy. Our global economy would look so different, but for diesel, and it still is fundamentally the same technology he introduced in 1897.
It's an incredible story. And again, thank you for writing this book, because I had no idea. I want to ask about you too. How do you trace your career from a tech CEO to a novelist and then to a historian? Because one of the jokes in people who I've spoken with on the show, are people say like, "Oh, it'd be so much fun to write a book," and people are like, "No, it's not." So how do you trace this? This sort of resume that you have that wound you to this point?
Well, I'll answer both. I'll answer the second one first. It's not easy to write a book, but it is fun. I loved it. I already miss working on this book on diesel. And I have a number of friends who are writers who always say, "Oh my gosh, I'd rather, go paint my house or clean something and then sit down and face that page." They procrastinate. I'm the opposite. I run to it. I love that time to myself. I embrace my alone time. It's challenging stuff, but it's really fun. And the research phase of this starts to bleed into answering the first question of transition from novel writing to fiction. But I've always done a lot of research even for my novel writing, because I feel like that allows me to deliver things on the page with more force and credibility. I wrote a book about a tennis prodigy, for example, a fictional novel about a tennis prodigy, and it was really emphasizing our terrible and growing obsession on early single sport specialization. And tennis is one of the extreme examples of that. But I interviewed James Blake and John Isner and many other people. I interviewed dozens of people for that book. And I enjoyed that piece of it. And the research on Diesel, a little different. Everybody's dead. There's nobody to interview. So it was all archival. But it was like the geeky side of Indiana Jones. I'd be in like some archive and I'd find some scrap of paper. And if anyone else passed it, I mean, really, maybe anyone else in the world, because at this point, I think I know more about Diesel than anyone. You'd think, oh, you wouldn't think much of it. But it's like, wait, he said this right after Winston Churchill said that. Or, it's like, oh, my God, this is gold. In the context of my story, this means so much. It explains so much. And I can't wait to, share what I found here with people in this book. So the transition from novel writing to nonfiction writing for me was easy because research is a common thread there. And in this case, I had the bones of the story, and I was just trying to do justice to an incredible story that was out there.
When you were a tech CEO, were you thinking about writing a book?
It was never something I thought about as a career. I never had, in college or before taken a creative writing class or a writing class other than, probably business persuasive writing or something like that. But I'd never taken an MFA or something like that. But I always loved to read. I was always a geeky reader. Like I was the one kid in the summers who liked to have the rainy day because I would go down to the library and read my books. And I was kind of a nerdy kid. And so I had always loved that. And when I was running this tech company, I was traveling so much. I was always on planes or waiting for planes in the airport terminals. And one time I decided to just tinker around with an idea I had for a book. So I'd write instead of read in those moments. And later my wife and I were walking in Central Park. We had 2 kids and I was still traveling a ton. And she's like, my gosh, you're sort of grouchy and grumpy and short tempered. And I was like, this job is burning me out. I'm tired of flying around and, kind of got the idea like maybe I'll run with this thing. So she read the draft of the novel. One of these very potentially awkward moments in a marriage. If it's not good, you're like, oh my God, my
yeah, that's tough.
To write. And
that's
boy,
tough.
how am I going to tell him? Not good. But she liked it. And so I, long story short, I found an agent, found a publisher, published the first book and sold the company and haven't looked back.
Yeah. All right. You mentioned the word your wife. And if you want to find out who he's married to, you can Google it. But I want to ask, how have you found being married to someone who is in media exposed? How have you found that being married to someone in media has honed your sensibility for what makes a good story to write about?
Well, I mean, there's the direct and the indirect of that. I have a front row seat to how she puts on terrific shows and does her, news is still, you've got to deliver the news in a way that is story-like it has an arc. I've got to explain this very complex material and get it across in a way that people can understand it and absorb it. So I see that all the time. And then, of course, I get the direct version where she reads this and you get red lines all over it, like boring, no, unnecessary, or works better here, or I'm not sure this one works at all, and that sort of thing. So she is my first and most trusted reader by far.
So back to Diesel here. I want to ask, so, and again, you just be careful here with what you want to say and don't want to say, because we want people to go and, and support the book and buy the book. But how was Diesel's body recovered? And I was really interested by the fact that there was this twist of fate, that there was no official thorough investigation.
Right.
How does that kick off the rest of the story here after he goes missing?
Well, so some of the people reviewing this are calling it the greatest caper of the 20th century and this crazy investigation. And it really is. It's a bit like, Operation Mincemeat in a way, only crazier. And so one of the suspicious things about this is Diesel disappeared September 29, 1913. For almost 2 weeks, there is a frenzy of news reporting everywhere, from New York, Paris, London, Berlin, Moscow. All over the world, people are following this story day to day to day to day with updates about where he might be, what might have happened. And much of it is conflicting. There's testimony from people on the passenger ship that he was allegedly on, saying all sorts of different things that conflicted with testimony of other people. And then 11 days after his disappearance, a corpse is reported to be found floating in the Scheldt estuary, basically off the eastern coast of the North Sea, near the Netherlands. And so Diesel's son comes down, and the people who had found the body said that it was rough waters and they had to release the body back to the waves, but they took a few items out of the clothes of the body. And so Diesel's son, Eugen, it's spelled Eugen. I'm like, Eugen. And then the person I can tell, like across the phone, is like flinching every time I say Eugen. It's Eugen is how you pronounce it.
If you hadn't told me, I wouldn't have known that either. So there you go.
Yeah, so a little bit of German I learned there. He comes over and identifies the items as very specifically belonging to his father, Rudolf. So therein, they closed the case, suicide, he jumped off, son identified, a couple of things pulled out of the pockets of the body. And as you suggest, one weird thing is the passenger ferry, according to certain testimony of people on board, we had just crossed the Flushing coast and we were here and it was this amount of time. And so at the time he disappeared, they could say they were in international waters. There was no investigative jurisdiction, and there was no investigation at all. There was no investigative authority to sort of oversee whose responsibility this thing was, because they were out in international waters there.
How did the media, well, let me ask one more question. How does that fact kick off the rest of this story and the potential for these divergent and very, in some ways, salacious accusations that are made?
Exactly. So at that point, there was already talk, in not long or right around this time, Rockefeller was up to all sorts of crazy things. Ford and Edison were actually working on an electric car around this time. Ford wasn't necessarily down the gasoline path either. He was working with Edison to do a battery powered car, and his laboratory had a whole sort of campus of laboratories that got demolished in a very suspicious fire. And so people were like, wait, did Rockefeller do that? And so the media was running with stories because it was apparent. I mean, Diesel had just gotten back from a tour in 1912 all through America, where he was saying, I can end the American fuel monopolies through the force of my technology. We don't need your laws to do it. My technology will do it. You can let it happen naturally. And then Kaiser Wilhelm was also very suspicious. It was announced that Diesel was going to co-found this British diesel engine company to build submarine diesels for the Royal Navy. So that in Germany, at the height of this Anglo-German naval arms race, could be viewed as treasonous by some. And so the speculation was right there as to who would have a motive. And so that became the structure of the book in a way. Diesel's the main thrust, but it's this pillar of these main suspects. And when you explore how their motives came to be, you really understand the context of the time.
What did you notice about the media of the day and how it contrasts and compares to the media of today?
Gosh, that's a good question. I mean, I feel like in some ways the heart of it is still very similar. Like they were in the way that people are looking for clicks, that the headlines grabbed for this stuff too. One thing I will say though is that the governments had a little bit more control, I think, particularly in Great Britain, to send out. They had this thing called a D notice in Great Britain, where it was which stood for Defense Advisory Notice, and it was designed to control information, even in the media at this time, this time of heightened anxiety about war with Germany in particular. And so they could basically the government, Churchill, or who at the time was the First Lord of the Admiralty and responsible for preparing the Navy, could send a note out to all the newspaper editors and say, don't cover this. And they would respect that. I mean, that's impossible to fathom today.
Yeah, no kidding. All right. How much do you want to give up? And if you've already said enough, then we can move on. But how much more do you want to say here about your theories of what happened to him? And that is a big thrust of this book, as you sort of piece this all together and say, this is the most, as we can tell from 120 years, hindsight, this is the thrust of what likely happened to him.
I think I'll tell you what, I'll say it wasn't a suicide.
All right. That's a good
But
teaser. I like that.
yeah, because it's like you really have to come along the journey of all the information and the motives and get to know. I mean, one of the things that I love about the book is you get to know Rudolph himself. He becomes this three-dimensional character for you, and you get a sense of what he really is capable of too. But yeah, was not a suicide. I'll say that much.
What is the fate of Diesel, the fuel, not the man, as we move further towards the green economy? I mean, obviously there are directives that cars not be made with petro in the future, or at least we start to scale back on that significantly. What does the future hold for diesel? I guess if there's a lowercase d, the fuel, not the guy.
Mm-hmm. It'll be here for a long time. If you got away from diesel now, the whole world would grind to a halt. There are lots of technologies now sort of filtering anti-pollution technologies so that the diesel engines, I know they had a bit of a hiccup there with some people falsifying some emissions reports and things like that, but diesel runs pretty clean now. And so I think that it's here for a long time. And I wonder how much cleaner it might even have been had we gone down the path Rudolph had envisioned, which was that we were running on vegetable and nut oils, back from 1913. And had we been continued to follow because his whole mission was efficiency. He was one of the only people back in the turn of the century thinking about pollution and emissions. One of his big selling was like, look at this disgusting chimney stack blowing smoke all over the place and raining down partially burnt particles of coal. Like, there's none of that with the diesel engine. It was nearly odorless. The ships from the steamship from that design, you see these romantic old paintings of steamships and the smoke going. It's like that all went away. There were no chimney stacks anymore, which for a cargo ship meant it's a clean deck all the way for cargo, or for a battleship, it meant you can rotate your guns anywhere to any point on the horizon, as opposed to having these giant chimney stacks on the deck.
Boy, the story of fuel and of cars and of trucks really is sort of like a tragic hero kind of thing, isn't it? I mean, doesn't it just make you, kind of annoyed that the paths we went down wound up being really destructive in some ways? I mean, I sat in traffic for like 2-3 hours today. Like, they're the worst.
Yeah. And it's every one of those is pumping out some smog. And it's interesting how it really was manipulated. One of the tactics that Standard Oil did back in the day, like if you take China, for example, they were using natural gas and oils, like vegetable oils and things, for illumination. And Standard Oil would build these kerosene lamps, that obviously burn kerosene, and he would give the lamps away for free and give very, very inexpensive kerosene. And everybody would say, oh, this is great. And they'd all start using the kerosene lamps and the cheap kerosene that he was kind of dumping on the market. And then once everybody was using these lamps that they had provided and then started manufacturing locally, the price of kerosene went up. But everyone had already abandoned the other sources of illumination at that time. So he had ways of kind of driving what the technology was going to be. It's almost like the supply was creating the demand. They could flood it with the supply and create ways to use it. And then so the people would follow different ways. And that's really a little bit what happened with the car.
If you could design a monument to Rudolf Diesel, what would it look like? And would there be a pull cord that could make it sound like the diesel engine sound?
I like the rolling coal. No, he would like smooth and quiet, no emissions, no odor. That's what he would want. I think. Would
it be a statue?
Something humble and modest, and it probably wouldn't even be of himself. It'd be of like something kind of joyful, like, someone who had emerged from the industrial age, who was working, but was actually then found time to go, ride a bicycle with his kid instead of being in a factory for 18 hours or something like that, because now the engines can offload that burden and allow people a better quality of life.
One thing I love about this episode and interviewing you, Doug, is that you are also a book podcaster, just like me. Tell us about your podcast, Dedicated. How did you start it? Why? And what's your goal with it?
Oh, thanks. Yeah, it's called Dedicated with Doug Brunt. I produce it with SiriusXM. and I interview award-winning authors, and we talk about their process and their life and behind-the-scenes stories, what it's like on a book tour, going to book festivals, how they get started, and what's frustrating and what's fun. And I start every episode with my guest's favorite cocktail, and I'll make it there on the set. So we always get together in person in the studios at Sirius. And I've got my cocktail shaker there. So, sometimes Lee Child wanted champagne, so we just popped a bottle of champagne. And, but there's Amor Tolls had a Negroni. You name it. We've had martinis. We have all kinds of different cocktails. And it's really fun. I started it because, as you mentioned, I used to run a company, and I used to have an executive team and a board and investors and customers. And I enjoyed that piece. I mean, I enjoy my alone time, but not all the time, it's not 100% of the time. So when I first started writing, I started a small book club of other writers, and we'd meet at my apartment every 2 months. And I decided to make it into a book club, and it had some great writers in it. It was Nelson DeMille, Lee Child, Amor Tolls, Joe Cannon, a number of other writers, and we had a great time doing it. And I was telling this to a friend of mine at SiriusXM. He's like, "This should be a show. Like, why don't you just have these guys on one by one and just talk about all
the things?" Seinfeld. This is the show. Yeah.
Yeah. They talk about frustrations with agents or other things, whatever, have book to film deals and the weird pitfalls and things that happen there. So that was the beginning of it. And we just started season 2. Scott
How many episodes have you done?
Season 1 was 33 episodes. And let's see, Scott Turow is coming up. Elliot Ackerman's coming up. Fiona Davis coming up. So for season 2.
If you'd asked me to join the show, I would have said, "Give me a Miller Lite." That's
Steve Forbes came on in season 1. He was our only beer customer.
What did he have?
He just said Pilsner, so I forget what I got.
Right. I often ask authors about their dedication pages, and I didn't see one in the advanced copy that was sent to me. Did you dedicate this book to someone? Who's it going to be and why?
To my mom and my dad, who is deceased, but he died about 15 years ago. But it's Jackie and Manley, who are my mom and dad.
What's next? Do you think you're going to work on this book? I mean, I certainly see it potentially being optioned as a movie, or do you think you'll spend time with this and then go to another book?
Option discussions are happening, and that would be wonderful. I'm not a screenwriter, so I'm happy to consult, but I wouldn't pursue it in terms of its expression and whatever kind of film it would take on. But I am interested in staying with narrative nonfiction. I like this book. It's not a big biography like an Isaacson thing on Elon Musk or Steve Jobs. It's more narrative nonfiction, like Eric Larson and David Grann is what this book is, and I enjoy that. A novelistic way of telling history. And I have an idea, which I haven't talked to anyone much about, but I will say that my editor and I have joked that one writer's footnote can be another writer's whole book. You grab this nugget that sounds really interesting, you just go run with that. And I think in this case, one of my footnotes may be my own next book. And I love this period of time, this quarter century before World War I find to be a fascinating time in the world. There's some interesting stories in there that I want to take on.
Awesome. Douglas Brunt, the author of The Mysterious Case of Rudolf Diesel, Genius, Power, and Deception on the Eve of World War I. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. A real pleasure. Thanks.
Check out the book. Check out his website, douglasbrunt-author.com. He's on the website formerly known as Twitter @DougBrunt. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axelbank Reports, History, and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram @AxelBankHistory. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.